When Clara Reed paid $3 for a blind mule, the town thought desperation had finally made her foolish. But Clara found an old brass tag hidden beneath its mane, while Caleb Holt noticed something stranger. The animal always turned its head before distant cattle grew restless. Weeks later, wolves came down from the ridge. As riders scrambled into the storm, the mule followed a forgotten trail into the dark, a trail connected to the disgrace that had destroyed Clara's father. 3 weeks before the wolves came down from the ridge, Clara Reed stood at the edge of Red Creek's winter livestock auction with $3 folded inside her glove. It was everything she had left after paying another week for the narrow room behind Mrs. Harlow's laundry. Clara had learned to survive on little. She repaired feed sacks, mended harness, scrubbed kitchens, and accepted whatever honest ranch work a woman could find in a town that remembered the Reed name mostly for disgrace. Her father, Thomas Reed, had once guided cattle through the high country north of Red Creek. Then a valuable herd disappeared during one of his drives. The men with money said Thomas had chosen the wrong trail. Others whispered that he had stolen cattle and invented excuses afterward. No proof ever restored his name. By the time Clara grew up, most people no longer remembered the facts. They only remembered that Thomas Reed had failed. Near the end of the auction, an old scavenger named Elias Crow brought forward a blind mule he had found wandering months earlier near the northern hills. Crow lived by gathering abandoned tools, broken wagons, scrap iron, and anything else the open country had forgotten. He could not afford to feed the animal through another winter. The auctioneer called the mule worthless. The crowd agreed. The animal was thin beneath its dirty coat, blind in both eyes, and marked by an old scar across one shoulder. Nobody offered a bid. Across the yard, Silas Vane was busy inspecting a group of expensive yearlings with 2 cattle buyers. He never looked toward the mule. To him, it was only another dying animal at the cheap end of the sale. But Clara looked twice. The mule tilted its head when a cattle bell sounded beyond the pens. Then it shifted its weight in a way Clara remembered. She stepped closer. The pale scar across its shoulder brought back an image she had not seen clearly in years. Her father kneeling beside a younger mule, while Clara held a bucket of water. Her heart began beating harder. She offered $1. Someone laughed. Crow shook his head. Clara offered all 3. The auctioneer accepted. More laughter followed her as she took the frayed lead rope, but Clara did not answer any of it. Hunger worried her more than ridicule. She led the old mule quietly away. Silas Vane never noticed. That evening, beneath a weak lantern behind the laundry, Clara brushed years of dirt and tangled hair from the animal's neck. Her fingers touched something hard beneath the mane. She worked it free. A small brass tag hung from an old leather cord, dark with age. On its face was a worn symbol shaped like an R crossed by a short line. Clara stopped breathing. She had seen that mark before. It had been stamped into the trail gear her father kept locked inside a wooden chest before the world decided Thomas Reed was a thief. The next morning, Clara walked 6 miles to Holt Ranch with the blind mule following at the end of a frayed rope. Frost silvered the grass along the road, and by the time the ranch buildings appeared beyond the cottonwoods, her boots were damp and her hands were numb. She had not come to ask for charity. Holt Ranch was smaller than the Vane spread, but better kept. The fences were straight, the barn roof had been patched before winter, and every tool hanging beside the tack room had a place. Clara noticed those things before she noticed Caleb Holt crossing the yard with a feed ledger tucked beneath one arm. He remembered her from the auction. More important, he did not smile at the mule. Clara explained that she needed work and could earn whatever food the animal required. She knew harness repair, basic cattle care, feed records, and enough arithmetic to keep a supply book straight. She did not mention the brass tag hidden beneath her coat. She did not mention her father. Caleb studied her hands instead of her dress. The calluses along her palms told him more than the town's gossip ever could. He gave her a damaged saddle strap, a box of old buckles, and an hour. Clara finished in 40 minutes. The repair was not pretty, but it was strong. When Amos Bell, Holt Ranch's gray-haired foreman, tested the stitching, he pulled twice as hard as necessary and finally gave a small nod. Caleb offered Clara regular work in the barn, the feed room, and wherever an extra pair of capable hands was needed. The blind mule could use an empty stall, but its hay would be counted against Clara's wages like any other ranch expense. That small condition mattered to her. Caleb had given her a chance without turning kindness into debt. By noon, Clara was cleaning tack when she noticed a young steer favoring its left foreleg. One of the hands said the animal had simply been restless after transport. Clara watched it take 3 more steps, then pointed to the way it shortened its stride before placing weight on the hoof. Amos checked and found a stone driven deep beside the frog. After that, the laughter around the barn faded. Not completely. Men who had spent years believing a Reed could ruin anything did not change in a single afternoon. But they began watching Clara more carefully, and that was enough. The mule caused more curiosity. It never bumped blindly through its stall. It learned the water trough after one trip and seemed to measure distance by sound. When cattle moved beyond the barn, its ears followed them with remarkable precision. Late that afternoon, Clara was carrying a bucket across the yard when the animal suddenly stopped eating. Its head lifted, both ears turned toward the north ridge. Nothing moved there except winter grass bending beneath the wind. A moment later, a small group of cattle in the far pasture began shifting uneasily. Caleb saw it too. He said nothing, but his eyes stayed on the mule long after the herd settled again. That evening, Clara worked until the light thinned behind the mountains. Caleb left a wrapped piece of bread and cold beef near her coat without making a ceremony of it. She found it only after he had gone back toward the house. For the first time in months, being helped did not feel like being made smaller. Clara fed half the bread to the mule before walking back to town. Behind her, the animal remained perfectly still in its stall, facing north. Long after darkness covered Holt Ranch, it raised its head again. Several seconds passed. Then, every dog in the yard began barking toward the ridge. The barking stopped before dawn, but Clara did not forget the way the mule had raised its head seconds before the dog sensed anything beyond the ridge. Over the next several days, she began watching the animal with the same patience her father had once taught her to use with frightened cattle. The mule never moved like a creature lost in darkness. It counted steps between the stall and trough. It turned before reaching posts. It reacted to distant bells long before Clara could hear them clearly. Most strangely, whenever cattle became nervous in the north pasture, the mule seemed to know first. Clara kept the brass tag hidden inside the lining of her coat. She had cleaned it carefully at night. Beneath years of grime, the mark on its face became clearer. An R crossed by a short horizontal line. On the back, almost erased by wear, were the numbers 17 and 4. She remembered seeing the same mark on a wooden trail chest that had belonged to her father. But memory alone proved nothing. One cold afternoon, Caleb asked Clara to help sort old feed receipts in the ranch office. Holt Ranch had been losing money in small amounts that were difficult to explain, and he wanted every record checked before spring. The work led them to a cabinet nobody had opened in years. Inside were tax papers, cattle bills, and several rolled maps left by Caleb's father. Clara spread one across the desk. It showed Red Creek, before newer fences divided the open range. Several cattle routes crossed the hills north of town. Most were drawn in black ink, but one narrow trail near the ridge had been marked with the same crossed R she had seen on the brass tag. Her fingers stopped. Beside the symbol were 2 faded numbers, 17, 18. Clara felt Caleb looking at her, but he did not ask why her face had changed. He simply moved the lantern closer so she could read the map. That silence unsettled her more than suspicion would have. She followed the old trail with one finger. It left the north pasture, curved behind the ridge, and disappeared into a narrow valley that did not appear on newer maps. Then she noticed something else. A section of the route had been crossed out in darker ink. The correction was newer than the map itself. Someone had deliberately removed the trail from later use. Clara rolled the paper halfway closed. For years, Red Creek had treated her father's disgrace as settled history. Now a blind mule, a brass tag, and an altered map were telling her that something had been left out. Outside, Amos called from the barn. The mule had started pacing. Clara and Caleb hurried across the yard. The animal stood at the end of its stall, ears rigid toward the north. A few moments later, faint, lowing, drifted across the pasture. Caleb walked to the barn door. Far beyond the fence, cattle were gathering tightly together. Clara knew what frightened cattle looked like before men admitted there was danger nearby. She also knew the mule was not guessing. If you believe Clara is hiding the truth because she has a reason to be afraid, share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes the people who say the least are carrying the heaviest proof. Before sunset, Clara took the old map outside and compared the ridgeline with the land itself. The forgotten trail led directly toward the north fence, toward the same stretch Caleb had repaired twice that winter. Clara walked closer and knelt beside the wire. One strand hung looser than the others. She touched the break and felt the clean edge beneath her thumb. The fence had not worn through. Someone had cut it. By sunrise, Clara had already walked the north fence twice. The cut she found the evening before had been twisted back together so carefully that a rider passing at speed might never have noticed. Weather had not caused it, neither had cattle. The wire showed a smooth bite from metal jaws, and the loose strand had been placed where pressure from a frightened herd could tear the entire section open. Clara marked the post with a strip of cloth and said nothing until Caleb arrived. He listened while she explained what she had found. He did not dismiss it as coincidence, but he did not accuse anyone either. That restraint mattered to her. In Red Creek, suspicion had once been enough to destroy her father. Clara would not repay injustice by repeating it. They repaired the fence properly and began checking the surrounding ground. Near the lowest stretch, Clara found old wolf tracks hardened beneath a newer layer of frost. The prints had been there for days. The predators had already been testing the pasture, moving along the edge where cattle gathered when the wind came down from the ridge. That alone troubled her. What troubled her more was where the damaged fence stood. It was almost exactly where the forgotten trail on Caleb's old map entered the north pasture. Back at the ranch house, Clara turned to the feed books. Caleb had mentioned that Holt Ranch was spending more each month without increasing the herd. The difference was small enough to ignore on a single invoice, but Clara compared delivery slips against the quantities recorded in storage. The pattern appeared slowly. Several shipments claimed more grain than the ranch had received. She made a clean list with dates, amounts, and shortages instead of announcing that someone was stealing. Caleb studied the figures in silence. Amos checked the feed room himself and returned with the same conclusion. Money was leaving Holt Ranch in places where nobody had been looking closely. By afternoon, even the men who once treated Clara as an extra pair of hands had begun bringing problems to her before they became emergencies. One ranch hand mentioned a cow that had stopped eating. Clara found heat and swelling around the hoof and helped clean the infection before it spread badly enough to lame the animal. Another complained that the herd refused to graze near the northern corner despite good winter grass. Clara walked the ground and found old scat beneath a cedar stand, along with hair caught low against the bark. Wolves had been circling closer than anyone realized. She began keeping notes, dates of damaged wire, changes in cattle behavior, tracks near the ridge, feed shortages. Nothing alone proved a larger plan, but together the details formed something she could not ignore. Near sunset, Clara returned to the broken fence with Caleb and Amos. She searched the posts more carefully and found a streak of dark red paint near the base of one. Amos recognized the color. Several wagons belonging to Vane Ranch were painted the same deep red. Caleb's expression hardened. Clara stopped him before suspicion became certainty. Plenty of wagons in the county used red paint. A mark on a fence post was not proof that Silas Vane had ordered anything. If they accused him without stronger evidence, he would turn the town against them before Clara could even explain what they had found. Caleb accepted that. For Clara, his willingness to wait mattered almost as much as his willingness to believe her. The next morning, he asked her opinion before moving cattle from the north pasture. It was the first time any ranch owner had asked what she thought about protecting a herd. Clara recommended shifting the younger stock closer to the barn, strengthening the north fence, and keeping lanterns ready in case predators came down after dark. She also suggested that one rider inspect the ridge each evening, instead of following the same predictable route along the road. Caleb followed every recommendation. Nothing dramatic happened that day. That was precisely the point. A weak calf was treated before it became sick. Missing feed was documented before more money disappeared. A dangerous fence was strengthened before frightened cattle could break through it. For the first time since arriving at Holt Ranch, Clara understood that proving her worth did not require one heroic moment. It was happening quietly, one correct decision at a time. After dark, she went outside to check the mule. The old animal stood motionless beneath the barn roof, its face turned north. Then Clara saw movement beyond the pasture. A lone rider crossed the ridge where no ranch hand had been assigned to patrol. She called for Caleb. By the time he reached her side, the rider had disappeared into the trees. They found no one. But at first light, Clara returned to the north fence and discovered another strand hanging loose. This one had been cut during the night. After the second cut in the north fence, Caleb changed the ranch patrols. He stopped sending men along the same route and began checking the ridge himself. Clara often went with him because she noticed things others missed. Bent grass, fresh mud on an old trail, cattle standing too tightly beneath a clear sky. Their days slowly found a rhythm. Before sunrise, Clara began finding a tin cup of hot coffee beside the feed ledger. Caleb never mentioned leaving it there. A week later, he discovered the torn sleeve of his winter coat had been neatly repaired with saddle thread. Neither thanked the other. Some kindness felt safer when it did not have to be named. The ranch prepared quietly for trouble. Clara moved the youngest cattle from the northern pasture. Amos strengthened the gates. Lanterns and extra rope were hung where men could reach them quickly after dark. Through it all, the blind mule kept listening. Caleb noticed that it never searched for the water trough once it knew the way. It measured distance beneath its hooves and recognized the barn door by wind and sound. When cattle bells carried across the property, its ears found their direction with an accuracy that no longer seemed accidental. Clara finally told Caleb part of what her father had taught her. A trail animal that crossed the same country for years could remember slopes, water, echoes between ridges, and the rhythm of cattle moving behind it. She stopped before telling him that she believed this mule had once traveled beside Thomas Reed. Her father's ruined name still felt dangerous. One rainy afternoon, Caleb cut his palm on new fence wire. Clara cleaned the wound at the barn table and wrapped his hand with linen. He did not pull away. She did not hurry. Rain struck the roof while the mule shifted softly nearby. Clara realized she had forgotten what it felt like to sit beside another person without expecting judgment. That frightened her. Holt Ranch had begun as a place to earn enough money to survive. Now she knew which calf belonged to which cow, which floorboard creaked after rain, and where Amos kept his spare tobacco. She had started belonging before she allowed herself to want it. Caleb was changing too. He asked Clara's judgment before moving cattle. He left the ranch accounts open when she entered. He trusted her with the feed room key. None of it sounded like romance. To Clara, it meant more than promises. But every step closer to Caleb made her secret harder to carry. If the truth about her father brought Silas Vane against Holt Ranch, Caleb could lose far more than money for giving her a place there. That evening, Amos returned from the north fence, carrying a broken leather strap, stamped with the Vane Ranch mark. Caleb examined it without speaking. Before they could decide whether it was enough to take to Sheriff Cole, wagon wheels sounded beyond the yard. A polished carriage stopped at the Holt gate. Silas Vane stepped down with his attorney and a young clerk carrying a leather document case. He had not come to claim a mule. He had come to buy Holt Ranch. Silas Vane arrived at Holt Ranch, wearing the calm expression of a man pretending to offer mercy. His attorney carried a prepared purchase agreement. The young clerk carried figures showing cattle prices, winter feed costs, damaged fencing, and estimates of what another serious livestock loss might do to Caleb's finances. Silas had heard about the trouble along the north pasture. That was what he claimed. He spoke as if the cut fences, nervous cattle, and increasing wolf activity proved Holt Ranch was becoming too dangerous and expensive for Caleb to maintain. His offer was far below the land's true value, but it was immediate cash. Silas presented it as kindness. Caleb read enough of the agreement to understand what the man wanted. The acreage Silas was most interested in included the north pasture and the ridge beyond it, the same ground crossed by the forgotten trail on the old map. Caleb refused. He did not argue. He did not threaten Silas. He simply returned the papers. Clara watched Silas's politeness become thinner. For weeks, someone had been weakening Holt Ranch one small wound at a time. Missing feed, cut wire, frightened cattle, signs of wolves close to the pasture. Now Silas appeared with a cheap offer precisely when the ranch looked most vulnerable. It was not proof, but Clara no longer believed in that many coincidences. Silas turned toward the carriage. Then the wind crossed the yard. Near the barn, the blind mule raised its head. Its thick mane lifted. For one brief instant, sunlight struck the old brass tag hanging against its neck. Silas stopped. The change in him was small enough that most people would have missed it. Clara did not. The color left his face. His eyes fixed on the crossed R and the faded numbers beneath it. 17-4. For several seconds, Silas Vane looked less like the most powerful rancher in Red Creek than a man who had just seen something dead return from the grave. Then he recovered. Too quickly. His attention shifted to the mule, and his manner became almost casual. He suddenly offered Clara $50 for the animal. $50 for a blind mule bought weeks earlier for $3. He suggested the animal might be gentle enough for light work around one of his mills. The excuse made even less sense than the price. Clara felt Caleb looking at her. Neither needed to speak. Silas had ignored the mule at the auction because he had never known it was there. Now, after seeing the brass tag, he wanted it badly enough to pay more than 16 times what Clara had spent. Clara refused. Caleb backed her decision. Silas tried once more, raising the offer without explaining why an old blind mule had suddenly become valuable. When Clara refused again, something cold entered his expression. He left without another word. If you were in Clara and Caleb's place, would that $50 offer have been enough to make you suspicious? Share what you think in the comments. After the carriage disappeared, Clara removed the brass tag from beneath the mule's mane. She did not leave it in the barn. She carried it inside her coat. That night, a faint scrape woke her. Clara crossed the dark yard with a lantern. The barn door was partly open. The mule was unharmed, but someone had searched its stall. A strip of mane had been cut away exactly where the brass tag had hung. Whoever entered the barn had not come to steal a worthless mule. They had come looking for something Silas Vane believed should have disappeared years ago. At first light, Clara and Caleb rode into Red Creek. They carried no disputed ownership paper. They carried something more troubling. The brass tag, Caleb's old map, the vein-marked leather Amos had found beside the damaged north fence, and a description of the person who had entered the barn only hours after Silas saw the tag. Sheriff Nathan Cole listened without interrupting. Clara placed the brass marker over the old map. The crossed R matched. So did the numbers. 17-4. Cole agreed that Silas's sudden $50 offer was strange, especially after showing no interest in the mule before seeing the tag. The attempted search of the barn made the timing more serious. But strange behavior was not enough to arrest a powerful man. They needed records. They needed witnesses. They needed proof that survived more than suspicion. Clara understood. She had seen what happened when a town punished a man before proving the truth. While Caleb and Sheriff Cole examined the fence evidence, Clara searched the county's older cattle ledgers. Then she found Thomas Reed. Her father's name appeared beside the cattle drive that had destroyed his reputation. But the entry did not list Thomas as the only man responsible for the herd. Several riders were named. 2 owners were named. One carried the Vane name. Clara turned the page. There was no page. Someone had cut it cleanly from the binding. The removal was too precise to be age or accident. For years, Red Creek had remembered a simple story. Thomas Reed lost cattle. Thomas Reed was blamed. Thomas Reed died disgraced. Now Clara was looking at physical evidence that part of the official record had been removed. Sheriff Cole checked the winter auction register next. The blind mule had not come from Vane Ranch. Its consignor was listed as Elias Crow. Crow had given a rough address outside Red Creek and noted that the animal had been found wandering near the northern basin months earlier. near the country where Route 17-4 disappeared from modern maps. Cole sent word for Crow to be located. If the old scavenger could identify exactly where he found the mule, his testimony could connect the animal to the forgotten trail without relying on Clara's childhood memory alone. Outside the sheriff's office, Caleb gave Clara the same thing he had offered from the beginning: a choice. She could leave Red Creek before Silas understood how much they had discovered, or she could stay. Clara looked at the brass tag in her hand. For years, she had carried her father's shame because everyone else found it easier than questioning powerful men. She chose to stay. When they reached Holt Ranch near dusk, Amos was waiting beside the barn. The north pasture was too quiet. They rode toward the upper fence. The gate stood open. Cattle tracks scattered through the snow. Then, Clara saw the prints coming down from the ridge. Wolves, fresh ones. Someone had opened the very pasture Clara had warned them to protect. Clara did not need the missing page to understand what the brass tag meant anymore. She needed proof that could survive daylight. Before riding toward the north pasture, she returned to the ranch office and placed the tag beside Caleb's oldest map. The crossed R matched the forgotten trail symbol exactly. The numbers 17 and 4 marked a route that left the main cattle road, curved behind the ridge, and entered a narrow valley hidden from the open range. Clara finally told Caleb what she had been afraid to say. The blind mule had belonged to her father. Thomas Reed had once worked as a trail master on the northern cattle routes. The mule had been one of the animals used to lead supply strings and tired herds through difficult country. Clara remembered the scar on its shoulder because she had helped clean that wound when she was a girl. The brass tag marked the mule as part of Route 17-4. It was not a ranch brand. It was a trail marker. Years earlier, when the valuable herd disappeared, Thomas had been accused of leading the cattle away from the official route. What Clara remembered differently was her father insisting that someone had been moving cattle through a hidden valley and changing ownership marks before the animals reached market. No one listened. The Vane family had money. Thomas Reed had only his word. After the scandal, he lost his work, his standing in Red Creek, and eventually the strength to keep fighting the story told about him. Clara had spent years wondering whether grief had confused his memory. Now the map told her he had been telling the truth. Caleb opened an old storage chest that had belonged to his father. Beneath tax papers and cattle receipts, he found a narrow ledger wrapped in oilcloth. His father had purchased cattle through the northern route during the same season Thomas Reed was disgraced. The numbers did not match the county record. One shipment showed 43 head received. The official Vane account listed only 31. Another showed cattle entering Red Creek days after they were supposedly lost in the mountains. Beside several entries was the same notation, 17-4. Clara felt the last pieces settle into place. The missing cattle had not vanished. They had been moved through the hidden route. Someone had changed the records and left Thomas Reed carrying the blame. The altered map explained why Route 17-4 disappeared from later records. The missing county page showed that someone had removed part of the history surrounding Thomas Reed's ruined cattle drive. The old Holt ledger proved cattle had continued moving through Route 17-4 after they were officially reported lost. Elias Crow's auction record placed the surviving mule near the forgotten valley, and Silas's reaction connected the present to the past. He had shown no interest in a blind animal until the wind exposed the brass tag. Then he had offered $50 for something worth almost nothing. Hours later, someone entered Holt Ranch and searched the exact place where that tag had hung. Clara finally understood the fear she had seen on Silas Vane's face. He had not recognized a mule he once owned. He had recognized proof from a route he believed time had erased. And the repeated damage to Holt Ranch suggested the old trail mattered to him again. The north acreage Silas wanted to buy covered the entrance to Route 17-4. If Caleb lost enough cattle and enough money, he might eventually be forced to sell. Silas did not need to command the wolves. He only needed to know they were already coming down from the ridge. A weakened fence and an open gate could let nature finish what sabotage had begun. Caleb copied the ledger entries while Clara wrapped the original in oilcloth. Amos was sent to bring Sheriff Cole. Then the blind mule moved. It raised its head so sharply that everyone in the barn stopped. From beyond the ridge came a sound Clara had heard many times as a child. Not wolves, cattle in panic. The mule turned toward the old trail. Clara understood before Caleb did. The animal could not see the ridge, but it knew the echoes. It knew the slope beneath the wind. It remembered a road it had traveled so many times that blindness had not erased it. Then a long, broken howl came from the north. Another answered. The cattle began bawling louder. Clara grabbed her coat and the brass tag. This time she was not following a mystery left by her father. She was following the only creature in Red Creek that still remembered the way around the ravine. The blind mule entered the storm first. Clara followed with Caleb and the ranch hands behind her. Beyond the ridge, Red Creek's prize cattle were already breaking apart beneath the pressure of the wolves. Some moved toward the frozen ravine. Others crowded against the damaged fence. The mule lowered its head and found Route 17-4. Clara understood what the animal remembered. The forgotten trail curved away from the ravine, passed between two ridges, and entered the hidden valley. She spread the riders behind the herd. Lanterns, shouting, and movement pushed the wolves away while the mule gave the frightened cattle a steady direction to follow. One cow turned, then another. Soon the herd followed. No gunfight saved them. Knowledge did. The mule remembered the road. Clara understood the memory, and Caleb trusted her enough to follow. By dawn, most of the cattle stood safely inside the hidden valley. But saving the herd was only half the reckoning. Within days, Sheriff Cole assembled the evidence before a public county hearing in Red Creek. Elias Crow had been found. The old scavenger testified that months earlier he discovered the blind mule wandering near the mouth of the northern valley, close to the abandoned route, later identified as 17-4. He had never worked for Vane Ranch. He had never received the mule from Silas. He had simply found an old animal everyone else had forgotten. The county ledgers showed something darker. The page following Thomas Reed's disputed cattle drive had been deliberately removed. Caleb's father had kept an independent ledger, however. Those records showed cattle moving through Route 17-4 after animals on the same drive were officially reported lost. The old map carried the same trail mark found on the brass tag. Evidence from Holt Ranch showed the north fence had been cut with tools rather than broken by weather or cattle. The vein-marked leather Amos recovered lay near one of those damaged sections. And Silas had attempted to purchase the very north acreage crossed by Route 17-4 just as Holt Ranch began suffering losses. Then came the detail Silas could not explain. For weeks, he had shown no interest in Clara's blind mule. The moment he saw the brass tag, he offered $50 for it. That same night, someone entered Holt Ranch and searched the mule's stall, cutting away the mane where the tag had hung. The offer alone did not prove a crime. Neither did the missing page. Neither did the damaged fence. But together with the ledger, Crow's testimony, the hidden trail, and the attempted intrusion, they formed a history Silas could no longer dismiss as coincidence. The investigation widened to the older Vane cattle records and the sabotage at Holt Ranch. Thomas Reed's name was formally cleared of the accusation that had followed him to his grave. Silas Vane was held pending charges connected to property sabotage, attempted fraud, and evidence uncovered in the reopened cattle case. No one in Red Creek laughed at Clara then. The people who had mocked her $3 mule stood in silence while the truth about Thomas Reed was entered into the county record. Clara demanded no apology. She had something stronger, evidence. If you believe people deserve the chance to prove their worth before the world decides who they are, like this story, share it and save it for later. Subscribe for more stories where patience and truth get the final word. Back at Holt Ranch, Caleb made certain everyone knew who had understood Route 17-4 and saved the herd. He gave Clara the credit publicly. Several days later, he passed her room and saw the old suitcase open on the bed. Her clothes were folded inside. Clara was packing. Caleb stopped in the doorway when he saw Clara's suitcase open on the bed. For a moment, he said nothing. Clara understood the question in his face. She was leaving the rented room behind Mrs. Harlow's laundry, but she had not decided to leave Holt Ranch. Caleb did not ask her to stay because she owed him. Instead, he offered her a choice. The ranch needed someone to manage the feed books, breeding records, and winter supplies. Clara had already proven she could do the work, so Caleb offered her the position properly, with wages, responsibility, and a voice in decisions about the herd. She would stay only if she wanted the life. Outside, the blind mule stood peacefully in the small pasture near the barn. Nobody laughed at the old animal anymore. Children from Red Creek had begun coming to see the mule that remembered a road men had forgotten. The county investigation continued, and Sheriff Cole eventually sent Clara written confirmation that the surviving records no longer supported the accusation that had ruined Thomas Reed's name. Clara folded the paper and placed it with her father's old belongings. Clearing his name did not return the years he had lost, but the lie could take nothing more from them. Spring came slowly to Holt Ranch. New calves appeared in the lower pasture. Clara worked the ledgers and still spent enough time outside to notice trouble before it became costly. Caleb no longer left coffee beside her books without explanation. There were simply 2 cups every morning. Nothing between them changed quickly. That was why Clara trusted it. She had once believed survival meant needing as little from anyone as possible. Holt Ranch taught her something different. Belonging did not mean owing someone your freedom. A true home was a place that still wanted you when you were free to leave. So Clara closed the suitcase. She stayed because the ranch had become worth choosing. By summer, her handwriting filled the Holt ledgers. Her coat hung beside Caleb's near the back door, and the blind mule rested in the pasture where children sometimes left apples along the fence. When Red Creek told the story of the night the wolves came down, people no longer spoke first about the prize cattle. They spoke about the ranch girl they had underestimated and the blind mule they had called useless. Clara had once believed she bought him because no one else wanted him. In the end, the old mule had led her somewhere too, toward the first place where she never had to prove she deserved to stay.